Hi, everyone. This is Paul Casey, the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame educational video series, where we discuss Kenpo principles, concepts, related styles and systems and disciplines of the martial arts that fall under the law of the fist. And occasionally we'll examine thought process, teaching methods, and an insight to how our art is actually evolved. As a journey in the martial arts, it's not a one-night thing or a one course that you had in high school or college, but more of a lifestyle. And so much to be learned from the seniors that have walked the path for us to help us understand the modern martial arts that are now coming up and give an insight into how the art has evolved. Today, we're very lucky to have three of our finest seniors. These gentlemen are legendary in the martial arts. They've been on this event, the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame Educational Video Series, numerous times in the past. I am proud to say each one of them is a Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame member. And that's exciting. So we're going to get an insight to looking at everybody. And I'm happy to welcome to the show today, Grandmaster Chuck Sullivan. Hello, sir. How are you?
Doing well. Doing well.
It's good to have you here, Grandmaster Ted Sumner. How are you, sir?
Doing just fine. Thank you.
It's nice to have you. And then finally, Senior Master of the Arts, Mr. Bob White. Bob, how are you?
I'm doing really great, Paul. Thanks for having me.
I'm honored to have you guys collectively here together because between the three of you, we're just going to scratch the surface on something that really relates to what the martial arts about. As a young man coming up, I was interested in self-defense because I was bullied. And that was a long time ago, but that still continues today. We see that reflected in a lot of movies and entertainment, TV shows and whatnot. A young man or woman comes into a school and he's tired of getting bullied, but he wants to understand how to defend himself. But really, that's insignificant to the journey that he's going to pursue. So the fear factor is the one thing that I had in common with all those movies that I saw. And I can reflect on movies that, Mr. White was involved with, The Karate Kid and other things watching. When you look at the original Ed Parker School with Chuck Sullivan and the development of that. And then obviously Ted Sumner with his martial arts experience of competing in tournaments. So the fear factor was the hardest thing for me, the mindset, basically. And that was the lesson I learned. How do you address that issue, Ted, when it comes to a student walking in and instilling confidence in them so they can overcome this personal fear?
Well, it's a process. You have to start out teaching them, right from the very beginning, and little by little, as you work the various movements with them, you go more hands-on. You give them more actual physical interplay there, and let them see it work. You work it on them, you let them feel it work. They got to have both sides, or it's just not going to work. If you just let your student work it on you, he's never going to know until he, like Ed Parker said, you got to feel it, So that's where you start and you go from there.
Bob, you have a young student. How do you protect them from the failure of getting frustrated and say, I'm not going to do this because I'm getting hurt. I was already being hurt by others. I don't want that to happen. But how do you build that relationship so they can overcome that, so they can be a stronger person?
Yeah. First thing, I really try to explain to them that fear truly is a gift. You can't have courage unless you have fear first. If you don't experience fear, you're crazy. So embrace it, realize it is something that you're going to go through. But when you do it, what you need to do anyway, you become empowered, and that builds your confidence and your belief in yourself. Remember that fear is good, panic is not. So the idea is accept the fact that you're going to be find yourself in certain situations at time where you're going to feel that fear, but we try to really work on developing the skills to think clearly and come up with good decisions that prove to be fruitful.
Well, let's go to Chuck Sullivan. Chuck, you're in a situation, you were in the early parts of the Kenpo system being developed. Mr. Parker used a term to define freestyle. He had divided his system into three parts: basics, self-defense techniques, and then freestyling. And he called freestyling the combative method of freely expressing yourself physically. You were training and studying there. Did you guys train right off the bat from day one in freestyling, or was that something that eventually was it was presented later?
Right. No, in the beginning, I never saw anybody freestyle. There was when I was at the Southgate School, before he closed it, which was only a couple of months, I saw a couple of guys freestyling, and I immediately thought they're crazy. They got to be nuts. First of all, you have to realize that in those days we had absolutely no protective equipment whatsoever, except the cup, and not everybody even wore a cup. They just were doing techniques, and there wasn't really a necessity for it as long as everybody had good control. Well, I found out in a hurry that everybody didn't have good control, so I bought a cup. But in the meantime, we had no padding whatsoever, no mouthpiece, no headgear, no nothing, absolutely nothing. Bare feet, and you kept breaking your toes. The first time I saw two guys doing it, I said to myself, they're absolutely crazy. Well, then I realized when I got to the Pasadena that this was part of the art, and this was part of what you did. And like Bob said, you got to have some fear, because if you don't have any fear, I'll give you an example. I had a student who was teaching, and he had a bunch of kids, big kids. I mean, these kids were like all 6 feet tall, and he armored them up so much they couldn't feel anything, nothing. I mean, and these kids learned how to blast. Well, they went in there and blasted each other, not feeling anything. And I said to him, I said, Bob, you got to start weaning these kids off this protective equipment, because they get on the street and bam, somebody's going to hit them, and they're going to freak out because they've never been hit like that. I said, you got to make them fearful to get hit in the head so that they start protecting themselves. These kids were not protecting themselves at all. So I think I got off someplace, but the original question was,
on the Pasadena School, they usually in the beginning, first of all, you didn't have any children or young adults. It was
no, there were no kids. The youngest that I can remember was like 68 years old, and they were more like, excuse me, adult size. We had no children at all. In fact, there wasn't even children. I tried it over on Crenshaw Boulevard when Ed and I had the studio there, and it didn't succeed there at all. So okay. It was quite a long time till kids really came into it. The art initially was for adults only. Yeah. I think it really considered it a little too dangerous to teach children, because they just really couldn't be able to handle it.
Ted, is there a way of distinguishing between, say you have your beginner or the beginning student walking in and intermediate? Do you gravitate toward a slow introduction to that kind of contact in a freestyle match?
Certainly, you've got to ease them into it. First of all, they've got to develop a certain amount of skill. They've got to develop those fundamentals, and then they got to learn combinations. When I introduce it now, I was at a tournament. I think it was in Las Vegas. I was going to the Can, and there were a bunch of BKF guys there with a boombox, and they're playing the music, and they're going at about, I don't know, a third speed. And I watched them for a while. I said, "What are you doing?" They said, "Well, we're rhythm sparring." I said, "Okay, well, what the hell is that?" And they explained that that's how they put various combinations together, but they work it at a speed where it's manageable. Nobody gets carried away. Nobody gets hurt. And then in a tournament, they stay warmed up doing it. So I use that. I found that when you teach a few movements to two students and you tell them, okay, go half speed, you turn around and 10 seconds later, they're going full speed. And like Chuck said, blasting away at each other. So you slow it down, you put the music, they'll stay with the beat. And then you slowly speed up the music with it. That was their gift to me,
Bob, how do you reaffirm in that person's mind, that young student, to understand that there is going to be some pain, which is what we all experience. That's part of the learning process. But to turn the fear into a confidence builder so that they know that they can accomplish that goal of defending themselves?
Well, the idea is you learn to deal with the pain, and pain is never a barometer of the severity of the injury. You get your fingers peeled back. It's not fatal, but it hurts like crazy. You get shot in the spine, as Ron Sanchez says, you might not feel anything, but it's going to be fatal. So we kind of pain's a liar. And we tell our students that, I don't want anybody getting hurt, of course. And if something's serious, we'll deal with that. But it's like getting the wind knocked out of you, or getting hit alongside of your ribs or something like that. Nobody likes it, but you need it. You need to experience so that you can learn and move on. And it's also, if you stick somebody with a good punch and the person looks at you and says, hey, that was a great shot, as opposed to grabbing your stomach on the ground on your knees, calling for your mother, that's going to build your opponent up. So I think that's a real skill level, is the ability is pain management. Just realize, like in baseball, you get hit with a baseball, you don't rub it, you just keep playing the game. And the same thing in karate. If you get stuck, you don't want to confirm to the person that they're so powerful. You kind of put it on hold and then deal with it later.
Sure. Chuck, when the early days of the Ed Parker system in the early 60s, there really wasn't a tournament scene there, was there?
No.
No.
No, the first tournament I ever went to was in Chicago. And it flew a few of us back there. I'm sorry, what?
What year was that, sir?
It was in Chicago.
I know, but was it before the internationals?
Oh yeah.
Okay,
This was in around 19. Let's see, it was around 62. Yeah, and it was run so badly. I think that's where Ed got the inclination that he could run something a whole lot better, and that's where he came up with the internationals.
When you were watching it, did you participate in that tournament, or you just observed?
Yep, I did. I got about 4 matches in, and then I lost, and I sat there and watched the rest of it. And that was kind of funny because it was at a time where we had seen some of the other styles, but we hadn't really got into them very deeply. And I saw a Korean guy do a full-out spinning back kick, and our back kick was horrible. I won't even describe to you what it was, but we really did not have a rear hand kick. We really didn't, until I saw the Korean guy, and I nudged the guy next to me, who I didn't even know, and I said, "Wow, did you see that kick?" And he says, "Yeah, that's no good." I'm like, "What?" I mean, he dropped the guy, and this guy is saying that's, and I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He says, "My instructor says you never turn your back on your opponent." And I said, "Well, tell me this: how come the guy that turned his back on his opponent is up dancing around, and the other guy's on the ground in a world of hurt?" And he says, "Yeah, well," and I was like, I couldn't believe this guy could be so. I don't know how to describe it. I mean, he could be so unaware. And for the rest of the day, all I watched was the Koreans doing that spinning back kicks. I said, I got to take that home. And of course I did.
Did the Koreans and the traditional Japanese systems, did they dominate these tournaments, or were they just completely unique to themselves?
They, nobody really seemed to dominate. And at the time, I don't know. Nobody really dominated. Everybody was, and the judging was so bad that, for instance, back fists weren't called at all. I mean, I've seen a guy's face get split open with a back fist, and if you had a Japanese judge that said, "No power," really? Okay, good.
Ed Parker goes to the tournament. You're in Chicago. He sees this. He decides he wants to create the International Karate Championships. You were there in the first couple of years involved with that. Our first champion for the first 2 years was Mike Stone. He was more of a traditional system with and such. Did the Kenpos compete in that, or was it just mostly other systems?
It was everybody. Everybody competed. I got to tell you, the first international, 1964, was a bloodbath. The kids that I talked about, they were just going and blasting. That's what they were doing. Here you had young adult males that were already fighters, and now they learned how to fight more in a more sophisticated manner. So they went in there, and unfortunately, I'll give you a little example. After the tournament, or actually it was in the evening, 3 guys walked up to me and they said, "We want to thank you." I said, "You're welcome." "What are you talking about?" "Well, thank you for what?" They said, "For teaching us to block." They said, "So most of these guys have no idea about blocking, and they're getting half killed." Said, "None of our guys got hurt. None of my people got hurt in the tournament." Because at one point I was standing next to Ed Parker and I saw this guy walking across the floor. There was like, I think 8 rings going. And he walked across the floor. He's in civilian clothes, walked up to us and he said, "Mr. Parker, you got to do something about the control here." He was a tournament doctor. He said, I just witnessed 6 knockouts while I was walking across the floor." That's how much of a bloodbath it was. Ed grabbed the microphone and he said, "Stop, everybody stop, stop, stop." And they all did there and quieted down. And he explained to them, "We got to do something about the control." And to the judges, he's speaking to the judges. "Now, if it's a point and so on and so forth, or what it is," and everybody's really great. That's wonderful. That lasted for about 2 matches. And then everything went right back to what it was. So the first few tournaments were kind of a fiasco.
Was there, Ted, was there a fine line between self-defense, sparring and sport in the early days, or was it really a blurred line, as Mr. Sullivan was saying about control?
Well, we were taught control, and we had to practice control. I remember one of the exercises, you'd hang a ping pong ball on a thread, and then you'd try to hit it without moving it, or you'd hit the thread and not move the ping pong ball. So you had to work some measure of control, and that's how we were trained. But it seemed like once you went outside the school and you went to a tournament, it was like gloves are off. I don't know that guy, and I'm not going to worry about my control. But again, in the early days, it was all dominated by the Japanese, and they didn't like our technique. And what they were doing and what they allowed was very limited when you look at a Kenpo arsenal, what a guy's got. And so, we use the overhead palm hand a lot. They wouldn't score it. They wouldn't score shots to the groin. They wouldn't, like he said, the back fist. They wouldn't score it for us because they didn't do it.
So what were the differences? What were the Japanese looking for? Because remember, Kenpo was basically a self-defense system, not
Right.
That was the focus, to save your life.
Yes.
You weren't fighting for points or
Yes.
trophies, you were fighting. But then it evolved because of the tournament competition, like everything
Yes.
else.
Well, and we didn't have the mentality that they had toward competition. That was part of their whole thing. Now, if you look at judo and jujitsu, judo, they took jujitsu techniques that were not too injurious, and they built a sport out of it. Now then, in 1920, the Tokyo Police Department invited jujitsu masters and judo masters to demonstrate their technique, to see what they were going to train the Tokyo police officers in. And judo won all out because they did train like that. They did train hands-on. They did it every day. Now, granted, they had to instill rules. They said, okay, well, you can't do this and that to these guys. So they took away a lot from the jiu-jitsu guys. But the simple fact is, the judo guys in training and doing realistic training, even though they were hampered by rules or constrained by rules, they still were better when it came to actual application, particularly against an opponent. I mean, kata is beautiful in the air, but who's going to do a cartwheel in the middle of a fight for your life? So there's a lot to be said for that hands-on. Now then, that measure of safety, how far are you going to let it go? And there were times when it just got completely out of hand. But you let it go as far as it can go, and you still maintain some measure of safety.
Mr. White, when you came into the tournament scene, you were in the transition between no safety equipment to very little safety equipment to now full-on safety equipment. Can you walk us through what you felt like in those days and how that your interpretation of, did that help or hurt the sport?
Well, I think that the first time we ever fought with pads, at least that I fought with pads, and I was going to tournaments quite often at the time. I was fighting in the Mike Stone. It was a national all-star competition. And right before we go up on stage, we're all in the back getting dressed, which at that time, like Chuck was saying, getting dressed meant you put your cup on. That was how we fought. But Mike comes out with a box full of pads, and he starts throwing pads to each person and goes, tonight it's going to be full contact. So it was called safety equipment, but it was everything but safety equipment. So it was interesting to watch these very highly skilled people, because two things happen. When you hit somebody in the face, they either got scared or they got really angry. And in both cases, emotions took over and it affected their technique. So our battle, we ended up winning. We beat the Joan Reed team from Washington, D.C. Our plan was you bow in and you hit him in the face as fast as you can and see where it goes from there. Unfortunately, I had a great team and we prevailed. But I think Ed Parker would talk about the pads is it gave everybody a license to hit. And they did. I mean, it stopped being focused techniques. Like you'd no longer throw a ridge hand and stop it. You'd throw a ridge hand and try to spin the person's helmet. So, I mean, it changed quite a bit. And the rule of thumb in sparring always, as far as control, is you hit somebody as hard as you expect to get hit back. The sport does kind of police itself. Earlier mentioned about breaking somebody into sparring. And personally, I would rather have one of my white belt beginner students fight Benny Urquidez or Mike Pombero, because who has better control than these guys? They have nothing to prove. They're going to work with somebody and help them develop their skills. When people get hurt, it's when two white belts fight each other, because they don't know what they're doing. They're controlled completely by their emotions and not by the control of their technique.
I have two questions. I'm going to follow up on this. Do you think, and this will be an open question for the other two gentlemen as well, do you think that the safety equipment started to hinder or hurt the sport because of the control issue, or was it because of liability issues for promoters? That's the first thing.
Yeah, I think you're right about the liability. It changed the rules completely. It took away so many different tools. And it wasn't just the creation of this safety equipment. It was that people got more concerned about potential litigation, and they took away the sweeps. You know, we were talking earlier, you used to be able to do takedowns, and we were fighting on the concrete floor at the internationals. Now there's no takedowns, and we're all fighting on mats. So, I mean, everybody is so concerned about getting sued. But I don't think it's so much personally that the safety equipment made us take a step back in the sport. I still think there's some really talented people that train tremendously like pro athletes that are the top of the line in our sport. I don't necessarily like the way the rules have gone, but I think the caliber of fighters is just tremendous these days.
Chuck, going to you, do you think that the equipment, safety equipment, has hurt or hindered the sport aspect of the martial arts?
That's really tough. I think it's a whole lot like Bob says, and it's how you perceive it. I don't know. I can't say. I think it's more of an individual thing. There's some people who ignore it completely, the fact that they've got it on, and they just act like they would normally. And then there's others who take advantage of it or think they are. I can't really answer that question.
I'm going to go to Ted. Ted, how do you feel about point karate, where they do points, versus continuous sparring?
Well, you're talking about sport fighting as opposed to training for a real situation.
You can break it down either way. I mean, there is
Okay.
continuous continuous fighting in sport tournament now. They have a division for that.
Yeah. No, I like I say, I'm not terribly interested in a highly limited sport. I'm interested in the sport and how it will help to augment your ability to defend yourself should the situation arise. So going back to your question about the safety equipment, one of the things I noticed when we, the first time I sparred, the match ended when we cracked shins, both throwing a roundhouse kick at the same time. Then when we got shin pads, I noticed people started laying the whole leg in there, which you could never do without pads, but they could hit you harder with the pads on than they could without it. And you would feel it even if you had your block up and they were hitting into your elbows. Didn't hurt them, but you take those pads off and they'd be down screaming like a baby for their mama because of how their leg would feel. So they got sloppy. We used to slip the kick in. We'd have to get between the blocking arms so that we didn't injure ourselves. And then once they put pads on, and then they put on the gloves and they go, oh, well, I got gloves, I'm not going to hurt them. We boxed in college with 16-ounce gloves. They're putting on these little 4-ounce gloves and then they're going full power into the guy's head. You got to control that. And not only that, but then when you sharpen your control skills, it makes your art better. You're much more devastating in self-defense when you've got control.
I'm gonna go to Bob on this. Bob, when you're teaching the young students, would it be preferable to have, say, the beginners to intermediate doing the point sparring and then the advanced belts to use continuous sparring?
Yeah, I think it's a tool, and you vary through their education as they become more prepared to handle like a continuous. As far as the continuous division, for the most part, it's a very undisciplined competition. The people that are judging, in many cases, are not really prepared to control the ring, and it ends up being a bloodbath because there isn't anybody controlling. So I think fighting's fighting. I remember Joe Louis saying that, whether you're fighting for points or you're fighting for continuous, you prepare yourself to do the best with the idea you want to win. And it's not the will to win, but the will to prepare to win. So you take those steps and you train athletically and give yourself the best opportunity to be successful, whatever type of competition it is. Chuck said something earlier that I really liked, and he was talking about his students telling him they were grateful that they learned how to block. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the things that we really like to emphasize here is somebody's defense. And if you ask Benny Urquides what he feels is the most important aspect of his fighting, he would say his defensive skills. Mm-hmm. Not getting hit. There's a lot to be said for that.
I'm going to go back to Chuck Sullivan here. Chuck, my position on it is sort of like the journey, the small little steps, the crawl. You stand up, you start to walk before you can run. I think I like the idea of the point competition in the school because it gives the students an opportunity to have the teacher stop it and correct them and see, did you understand what that was? And it's under control, like you said, with rules. Most of you three gentlemen grew up where there was basically, it was bare knuckle and we're going to go to war. But you did use some control on that. I think it's sort of like learning your basics. Then you reinforce your basics. Then you start to expand past that with your self-defense techniques. And now you will have to learn how to incorporate maybe that motion in a response that you don't know how the opponent's going to attack you. I mean, if I'm doing 5 swords, I know the man's going to do a step through roundhouse punch. But in a sparring competition, I don't know if he's throwing the punch or he's going to throw the kick. And so therefore, the idea of having this systematic going up the system till you finally get to the point where it's spontaneous combustion, so to speak. Right there, Mr. Sullivan?
Well, I've always felt that stopping for each point was counterproductive.
Why?
For the simple reason that there's, you hit it, it's done. You don't follow up. I mean, in most fights, the first shot is just a stun, and then you follow up. And if you get used to stopping at that first shot, and it becomes a habit, I just think it's counterproductive. I always have. I can see what Bob said. I think you're right. To start people off that way, very fundamentally, to make them understand what a point is and what a point isn't. I think that's good. But I mean, that would be just for the beginning. As far as in tournaments, no. A boxing match, they had to stop for each punch that scored. You got to keep the points in your head. The judges have to do that, and at the end, pick a winner. And of course, you should be pointing out, like telling how many points the various different opponents got. Because if you got one guy that gives them 4 and one guy that gives them 14, something's really wrong. The judging is wrong. But you can't stop every time there's a point. I just hate that. I hate the whole idea. It's got to be continuous, because that's how fights are. They're continuous. They don't stop.
Let me go with this with you, okay? So in the self-defense sparring, we're looking to save our life. We're learning how to deal with, a confrontation and eliminate fear, have confidence in some of the basic skills. You and I have discussed Mr. Parker's The Secrets of Kenpo Karate lessons. You had yours in 62. I had mine in 82. we learn in our self-defense techniques in Ed Parker's system, okay? And also in Grandmaster Sumner's system, and then obviously in Grandmaster Sullivan's system. We look at the targets that present themselves, but in a tournament, we're not allowed to strike those. Is that a good thing for kids?
Yeah, I think the ability to utilize what Ed Parker said, speed, power, accuracy, but also the knowledge on where to go that are going to give you the best results, depending upon the environment that you're in. Like Chuck Norris said, if you could kick somebody, a good black belt martial artist, you could kick them in the head. You could certainly kick somebody in the knee or the groin if you had to. But from an athletic standpoint, the ability to put your foot wherever you want it to go with power, with speed, and with accuracy is what you can develop while you're sparring. Of course, you can't go to the knee.
I remember in the first days when I was there, the technique intellectual departure, and then they removed it from the yellow belt curriculum. And that was because most white belts couldn't control a back kick, And when you think about it, wow, these guys are flailing. So I guess in the early studies and training, you have to be careful to give the student that knowledge that will be beneficial to them, so they're not sitting there maiming other kids in school, or because you can seriously injure somebody in these circumstances. Is that right, Mr. Sumner?
Oh, I agree. I think, and I'm no expert in teaching kids. I mean, that's not anything I've ever done much, but in the situations where I've had to, I've found that the padding works well. You teach them good fundamentals, and what's more important for them than anything else is the fact that they don't start crying when they get hit, and they don't run away, and they don't stop and look for their mommy and expect her to run out on the mat and help them, because they get into it with those ghetto rats, and they'll think that's funny, and they'll stomp them real good while they're crying for their mommy. It's getting over that fear of physical contact, and being willing to move in and mix it up and get the job done. And do they learn a lot of the really good stuff that we've got? No, but I've seen more fights finished with a reverse punch than anything else I've ever seen. So, yes.
You come from a law enforcement background where you're taught now, and it's even more prevalent now with the current temperature in this country about how we dress police officers. I mean, it's very disrespectful, but you are more into a restraining type of responses to a suspect or an altercation that you have to deal with, rather than aggressively punching somebody out.
It all depends on the situation. I mean, what the public usually sees is arrest and control. It's you and this individual. He may be a drunk, he may be whatever, and so you're very careful. But they don't see it when you pull over, a motor rat in the middle of the night, and he pulls off on a side street, and 5 others pull up right behind him, and you're there alone, and you got to deal with it, and they decide they don't want a ticket, they don't want to go to jail, and they decide maybe they want to put your badge in a collection they've got of officers' badges that they've knocked the hell out of. Well, you're gonna handle that a whole hell of a lot different than arrest and control, and that's not point fighting, and that's not continuous fighting. That's fighting for your life.
Do you use a lot of role-playing examples in your training with your students?
Well, I do to a certain extent. I mean, I use a lot of examples of things I went through, you know, to establish relevance. I mean, to teach an adult, and that happens to be my particular specialty, is you've got to establish validity and relevance, or their attitude is, why should I learn this? You know, and particularly when you start and you've broken it down and they're learning components that they're going to be putting together, well, they can't see where that's going. And so unless you can establish that, you're probably going to lose them somewhere along the line there. So that's why we usually start out demonstrating the attack on them. And if you have to do it with a little bit of authority there to let them know that that's a dangerous attack, well, you know, that's what they're there for. That's what they're there to learn.
Did you spend any time in the military?
Yeah.
Okay. What branch of the, oh, you're Army. Okay,
Yeah.
great. So mindset they try to teach you in boot camp. And how does that relate to the martial arts?
Boot camp in the Marine Corps is is to break you down and then build you up. So relating it to the martial arts is very difficult, because I think their goals are really different. They're trying to regiment you. They want you to be able, that's what close quarter drill is all about. You say, heel out, flank, hook. You got one step before flank and hook to decide which way you're going and what you're going to do. And that's what they want to get you to do. They want to get you to where you will take an order and execute it within one beat. So they say, Sullivan, hit over that, boom, you're there. You don't think about it. You don't think, look and say, you know what? I'm better off here. I don't think, no. You don't even think about it. Boom, you're there. I think that's their mindset. So how you can relate that to the martial arts, I don't know.
I think you're looking at preservation. They know that he who hesitates meditates in a horizontal position, to
That's
quote
true.
Ed Parker. In other words, you're going to die. Okay, you're going to die. You know, we're trying to soften this up. You have civilians walking into a school and they say, Mr. Sullivan, I'm so tired of my son being beat up. He's a good boy. His father died. I'm a single mom trying to raise him. Can you help him? And you take on the role of the father figure, to instill into this kid, because he's feeling sad. He doesn't have anybody there and he's being bullied, but you don't want him to go around killing everybody. So you try to educate him in a certain way, or maybe you do. I don't know.
Well, see, here again, Paul, you're talking to the wrong guy. Ted and I are on the same level here, because I never taught kids. I don't like kids. I didn't like my own kids till they could have a beard.
Did you tell that to your daughter?
Like I said, until they can have a beard, then now they're my buddies. No, it really is. I really don't. I can't relate well to children. I have a tough time with that. Again, I think the art is really for adults, or when they get up to around 16 or so, they can understand what it's all about. I think it's not bad for kids. It's probably great for kids. I've just never had the experience.
Bob, you're same question for you. We're going to get right into that with you. You have this situation. It could be a young adult now. It's a young woman coming in, and she, in this day and age, she's being cyberbullied and she's feeling horrible about herself. And as we know now, we're seeing a lot of young adults committing suicide because of the emotional distraught they receive, because they rely strictly on that little electronic thing that they talk, and that's their life. And they feel that's how they're identified. How do you deal with that so you can instill in them that they'll have that confidence, but you don't want them to go out there and taking everybody out, like ninja?
Well, obviously, I'm not a sports psychologist or a psychologist of any kind, but I do know when people are doing things that make them feel good about themselves, they have more peace in their lives. And I think that if we can emphasize with a new student, say it was a young student, or to the parents, that we want to teach them to try to start to control their emotions. That emotion's the enemy, whether you're controlled by fear or whatever it is, to be able to think clearly under stress. And that's what karate does. You know, you get the idea of somebody come up and having an attack, or maybe you're doing some sparring, and we know that emotions are there. And the more they do it, the more they get comfortable, and more self-control and good decisions are made instead of emotionally fueled decisions.
One of your top students I had a conversation with yesterday, and he said I would go in there and all I do is try to intimidate him. You know, like it. And even Ed Parker said, I want to see you intimidate him.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about. Isn't that the mindset you need when it comes to sport? Karate, you need to make sure that your opponent will not get a free pass on you. And if you can use the psychological, it can help.
I think that's important, that you establish the fact there are no free rides. And a lot of people, you know, everybody's different. You know, some people will rely on the intimidation. Other people, you look at, like Benny Urquidez would go up before each fight and go, hey, let's put on a good show. You know, and the other person's thinking, put on a good show, I'm scared to death, you know. But Benny was comfortable enough that you could tell he was in there having a great time, and other people are wanting to go home. So I think that controlling the emotions is critical.
One time I did a seminar, and I was asked to recreate Friday night in Pasadena, because that's where I spent all my life, in the Pasadena school. And I would love to go to the Friday night class, because it was run by either Roger Meadows or Jim Faria or something like that. And then occasionally Mr. Parker would pop his head in and watch and smile. And you got to see all the old school guys like Phil Conte and Kenny Johnson and all the guys that were hanging out there with Sammy and Fudd and Bud. And, you know, it was like all these, it was really a good time. But the thing, I remember when I was down in Florida, and they asked me to do the seminar, and I said, okay, I'll recreate the Friday night class. And I did a role-playing situation. That's why I asked you three gentlemen this. And I gave the scenario, and I'll make it really brief. One of the gentlemen down there looked like he was the barber from Mayberry RFD, you know, with a little mustache and real clean. And then I had the thug that was the bouncer. And I had a scenario where John came up in his brand new BMW that his wife owned. He was coming up to the car, and he noticed there was a big scratch on the passenger side. And Tony was standing next to his car, walking back to the car, and he was getting in it. And John challenges him on it. He said, why did you hit my car? And then there's this confrontation. So we had Tony, who looked like he was in Scarface. And then you had the other guy from maybe RFD. And I purposely put them together to see what this was how it was going to result. We were talking about pushes and punches and kicks related to, say, a right-hand side. And I let them work on it. And the group was watching this. And finally I said, how do you think Mr. Parker would handle this? And they all said, oh, well, he'll probably do 5 swords or 5 ace or thundering hammer. He's going to kill him somehow. And then that was and finally I said, I think Mr. Parker would have probably said, you know what? I've got insurance. I'll file it with my insurance company. Thank you. Now the guy, and the reason he would do that, because he would give that person a free pass to make him think psychologically that he was passive. Okay. But then that guy had a false sense, his arrogance, which is the ego part, which is something we've been talking about. The ego part is, oh, well, this guy is a pushover. I'm going to see what's going to happen. And that would be his demise. It'd be over in a second or two with Ed Parker. And so my question for you, Bob White, is that when you have the higher level advanced students at your teams, which are incredible fighters, they've won numerous championships. They're well respected from the early eras of the 70s up until even now. How do you mindset those guys so that they're constantly in control and that can intimidate their opponent? Yet they might have fought these guys before.
Well, I don't know if intimidation actually is the right word. I think just the idea that these people have developed a habit of winning. They expect to do well. They expect their techniques to be like the weather. The person might know it's coming, but there's nothing they can do about it, because it's all a result of the effort that they put in to prepare themselves. And they are ready, and then you project an air of confidence in yourself. And you know, it's like, I know you've talked to Mike Stone quite a bit. You know, his attitude was so confident, he didn't really even care who his opponent was. His opponent wasn't going to affect the way that he fought. He knew what his plan was, and that was to go in there and impose his will. And it didn't matter who was in front of him. And I really try to emphasize that with our guys. It's just prepare hard, train hard, and it depends less on who you fight. It's all about how you carry yourself.
Yeah, did you intimidate people when you competed?
Did I?
No, Ted, Mr.
Okay.
Sumner.
Oh,
Mr. Sumner, did you intimidate people when you got in the ring with them, or did you wait before and try to freak them out?
Well, let me clarify. I mean, I was like Bob. I was blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid with rosy cheeks. You know, nobody was frightened by my looks. I had a ferocious ki, and I never wore a mouthpiece because I could shock them with that ki. Now then, 5 years ago, I spent $30,000 getting my teeth fixed too. So you know,
I guess you weren't whistling Dixie then, huh?
Yeah, there was a payoff. But yeah, there's when I was a police officer, the uniform has a certain level of intimidation. You know, but yes, that's definitely a factor. Now the other one is like Bob was saying about being comfortable with what you're going to do. And it's amazing once the emotion wears off, once the first punch is thrown, if you're well trained, if you're well conditioned in this art, you just let it take over. And it works. It takes care of itself. You know.
Chuck, did you intimidate people on the mat?
I don't think I've ever intimidated anybody. No, the only people that I could possibly intimidate would be the people that already know me. And they know what I can do. And otherwise, no. I'm just not that imposing a figure. Never have been.
Did you have a game face though when you met up with somebody?
I never looked at my face. I haven't the faintest idea what they were saying. I don't think so. I mean, my lower lip wasn't trembling or anything, but no, I really think that freestyle in general is, you got to do it. I mean, you have to do it. There's no way around it. We all know people who never freestyle. Never. You've never ever seen them freestyle ever. And we know who they are. I'm sorry. I have absolutely no respect for them at all as martial artists. None.
No, it's interesting listening to the three gentlemen and how you approach something. And we see it has, this is a general question. I'm going to pass it around to you before we close up shortly. Has the sport aspect of it, has it been fully explored or not? Let's go with Ted. Ted Sumner.
You know, every time we think we've gone as far as we can with it, we find a way to go a little further, you know. So no, I don't think it's in any way done. I think it'll continue to develop and evolve. And I think in 10 years, we'll be seeing things that we don't see now. So, you know, as long as people keep their mind open and aren't afraid to go there, no reason it shouldn't continue to develop.
Bob, you know, we're having, I think it's, is it Japan's hosting the Olympics soon, correct? Or is it China?
China is.
China?
You talking about the Winter Olympics?
I know there's the Summer Olympics.
Oh, okay. That's next week, the Winter Olympics. So
No, where they've added now, the Olympics has now added karate to their games. They have judo, obviously, and then they had I guess the taekwondo. They've added karate because the Japanese are going to host it, I believe. Is it going to expand where we're going to be able to see more different systems get involved with that, or is it going to be limited?
No, it'll be really limited because the people that are in control, they've got their foot in the door in the Olympics. They're not going to welcome open competition. They're going to be able to get some control, which I kind of understand, because dealing with a bunch of karate people is really hard because everybody is so concerned about their techniques being better. Like Chuck was talking earlier, right at the beginning, about the guy that dismissed the spinning back kick that just laid somebody out. You know, that's how a lot of your traditional styles are. They're not really welcoming to other ideas or new ideas. And a lot of times the people that are in the open competition are not maybe the most disciplined people, and there's no real coordination of rules. And it's just big sponsorship looks at this and they go, I don't want to get in the middle of this. Like years ago, we had the Budweiser team for a couple of years. Budweiser started dealing with a lot of dissension and abuse, and they ran. So, you know, I think that it's going to be real hard to move forward as far as from a business standpoint. Now, from an art standpoint, I think the guys are getting tremendous. The guys now, if you get a chance to watch Raymond Daniels, his highlight film, every fight's a highlight film. He's doing techniques that people only dreamed of 30 years ago or never dreamed of. It was beyond their wildest dream. But it's amazing what these athletes can do. They keep fighting and they keep getting better.
Chuck, full contact we're seeing in the MMA world of the UFC and such. Is that part of the karate world, or is that just a completely different animal?
I think it is a different animal. Boy, these guys are rough and tough. I got to tell you that what they're doing, and that of course is on a professional level. I mean, this isn't something that you know, that you would do in just a normal dojo. I mean, this is another thing altogether. And as far as the Olympics are concerned, I hope it doesn't wind up like it did in Korea for the first time they introduced Taekwondo, because the man that won that gold medal absolutely and positively was beaten badly by the kid that came in second. And that kid refused to get up on the podium to stand there for the medal and during the ceremony. And his instructor, I saw shots of him, he was like head forehead to forehead, and he was pleading with this kid, you got to get up there, and the kid says, I didn't win second place, and he didn't. I mean, it was so blatant that it was embarrassing, really. And I just hope that nothing like that happens in Japan.
Chuck, excuse me, Ted, is MMA realistic?
Well, sure. You see what they're doing. I mean, they're knocking each other out.
But I'm going to qualify that. Is it realistic? That's a pretty wide open question.
Sure.
In they have rules. They're inside a caged area. They have an official.
Yeah.
Is that truly the modern version of self-defense sparring?
Thank you. I was hoping you'd ask me this one. The simple fact is they do have rules. They call it, you know, no rules, but they don't strike to the eyes. They don't strike to the throat, and they wear cups. And I've gone over all of our stuff, and I can only find a couple of self-defense movements where we don't strike those three spots, at least one of them. Do you remember the first Ultimate Fighting thing where Keith Hackney was fighting the sumo wrestler? And the sumo wrestler watched him, and then he finally got him sized up and he charged him. But when he hit him, it was right at the gate. The gate flew open and they fell out into the audience. If it hadn't been for that, he'd have had Keith. But then when they came back in, Keith saw, okay, he's faster than I thought. He kept his distance and he started just nailing him with that palm strike. And he was coming down on his forehead, his nose, finally broke one of his teeth out. The guy started crying and the match was over. The simple fact is, when they're doing that, as far as I'm concerned, that's not martial arts. What they're doing is showing me what I need to train to defend against, because that's every kid out on the street, every little thinks he's an MMA fighter. What's he going to do first thing? He's going to try to shoot in on you and go in on your legs. I don't look at that and say, well, I need to learn to do that. I look at that and I say, how do I learn to defend against that? Same thing with that kick that Chuck saw in '62. First thing I'd be wondering is, whoa, how do you defend that? So they're showing us, okay, this is brawling. We're artists. Okay, you take and they're throwing chaos at their opponent, and what we do as artists is we construct order out of that, and then we crush them with it. So I think it's good entertainment, but it's not what we do any more than professional boxing is like what we do. Would I want to fight, you know, professional boxer like Holyfield? No, no, those guys are good, and they hit hard. But do we train to handle those guys? Sure, we do. That's what our long range kicks are for. That's what going into those tender targets, the knees and the groin and that kind of thing. So yeah, is it going to be around? Sure. Do people want to train in it for self-defense? Ooh, that gets real messy. Every time I've had to go to the ground on the street, it's been on broken bottles and rolling over curbs and wino vomit and blood and everything else. So no, I train to stay on my feet where I can maneuver, and I don't want to go onto the ground with those guys. Let them go down there.
Bob, do you cross train your students with other aspects of the other arts that you're introduced to?
Well, a lot. You know, I was fortunate. I had an opportunity, like Chuck again talked about the spinning back kick. I had an opportunity to go to a lot of tournaments and work out with the Chuck Norris people, and Benny Urquidy's guys would come down. Benny would come down and stay the weekends, and you know, you really get an eclectic idea. We have some ground guys come in. Ron Sanchez is a brown belt in jiu-jitsu. I mean, it's certainly part of education. But as far as the MMA, I think Thomas Jefferson said to teach somebody self-defense but not develop character at the same time is a disservice to society. And I think so many of these guys, while they're learning fighting skills, they're basically also preparing themselves to go to jail as felony school, because there is no self-control. There is no de-escalation. It's ground and pound right off the bat. So I don't think, I think it has a great sport to watch, but I certainly hope it doesn't become a dominant thing in our society. I
think what it is you're right. It's just an entertainment value for us to watch these people just hurt each other, or we think they're hurt, you know, and is that realistic? And, you know, back in the early days of the Kenpo system, Chuck, you were there with Mr. Parker. What was his position? What was his opinion on ground fighting?
It never came up. Back in the 60s, it never came up.
Why?
We would fight on the ground, keeping people away from us, and then recover back to our feet.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as grappling and being on the ground, it never came up. It was never even contemplated.
How about you, Bob? Did Mr. Parker ever talk about ground fighting to you?
No, but what he did, I remember him coming back from Brazil one time. We had the Monday morning management meeting, and he was talking about, if you haven't seen those things before, they could give you fits, because how can you defend against something you're not familiar with, which makes perfect sense. But he never really addressed the ground so much, other than getting back up on our feet, which is more of our home turf.
You, Ted?
Well, you know, the way we trained was classical. It's fundamentals, self-defense, kata, sparring, and then we learned to fall, we learned to defend, and we learned to get up. And like I tell my students, you know, when it's time to get up, get up. Don't mess around down there on the ground. You want to stay down there, you'll die down there. You get up. You drive them back with the legs. The legs are powerful, even on a small person. Drive them back, get up. And particularly if there's multiple opponents. I don't know, you know, in law enforcement where I've had to use it, it was always more than one person I had to deal with. And when I got knocked to the ground, I'd better get up quick, because I was in real trouble.
My conversation with Mr. Parker, those came up. And remember, this is prior. Mr. Parker died in 1990. So the big push for the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and all that was on the horizon, but it wasn't really the way it was later. And I'd asked him about that, and he said that's the place he didn't want to be there, because one, he had issues with his legs. We know that. But this is my take on it, was that you've entered into the equation an unknown element. Like Bob said, you know, you're talking about, if you've never had a dealing with a person that is a ground fighter, or if you've never had somebody that is a boxer, that Ted, you know, you never had a fight, though you have, Bob, or you've never been in a combat situation where you're fighting with knives, like maybe, and that was something, or a bayonet, like Chuck was taught in boot camp. Those are realistic things that you said, wow. And I believe that you're that unknown, you either become prepared with it, or that's going to be your demise, because now you've added an extra person to the equation that's unknown, and you may go to the ground and injure yourself, and now you've just helped your opponent and he walks off with your wallet or your life. So I'm not saying you shouldn't know these things or you should not be introduced to it, but you should also find out ways so that if you do go there, how to get out of there quickly. And one of the best lessons there's two lessons I learned one from Chuck Sullivan and Ed Parker. He was watching me once do the high kicks because I was doing all that, and David Lee Roth came into the school, and Frank was showing him stuff, and I was doing some of that up there. And Lee asked, Roth asked Frank to show him how to use that so he could put it in his stage show. And Parker laughed. He was talking to me. He says, "Paul, if you want to kick him in the head, kick him in the leg first."
In the groin.
Well, he kick him in the leg, the body goes down, then you can kick him in the head, is basically.
Yeah, well, kick him in the groin, the body bends over just right height.
And well, you can't really blow up the knee. It's sort of hard to stop that kind of stuff. The other one was with Chuck Sullivan say, "Hey, Paul, if you see the knife, run." So anyway, so let's give with final thoughts here, gentlemen. I really want to say thank you very much for taking the time and to give us a little bit of insight. I hope that the viewers, when they watch this, will start to explore this with each of you, and if not with you, at least with their instructors, on the two facets of what we're dealing with. There's any final thoughts you have here, Bob, before we close?
No, just really appreciate having the opportunity to be on the show with these two gentlemen. So they both are people I have a lot of respect for, Paul. So thanks for putting it together.
Thank you. How about you, Ted? Do you have anything that you would like to add?
Well, I'll say likewise to what Bob said, but I think what I would like to leave this with is you don't have to be a better MMA fighter than an MMA fighter to defeat him or to successfully defend yourself. You don't have to be a better boxer than a boxer to successfully defend yourself. And the same thing goes for wrestlers or anybody else. You stick, and you asked about Ed Parker. When we went into that whole kickboxing thing and we started doing the full he never deviated from the Kenpo. He said, when it comes down to it, the Kenpo is still going to be there, and it's what's going to save your life. So what I'm saying is, don't worry about that stuff. Learn it, learn how it works so that you can defend against it. And believe me, what you need to defend against it is in our art. I have never found it lacking. And that's just, my final words.
Any thoughts there, Chuck, before we close?
The best defense is a good offense. The preemptive strike will be the person who hits first usually hits last. And sometimes it's the same shot. It doesn't take but about one digit in an eye to finish a fight. So just the preemptive strike, be first. What did Mike Tyson say? Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. That's all it takes. That's all it takes.
I want to say thank you, Grandmaster Chuck Sullivan, for coming on today. I always love it. You take time out of your busy schedule, and it really is. It's good to see you here on the show.
I wish I could have seen you guys.
Grandmaster Ted Sumner, all the way from Texas. Thank you. I really appreciate you coming on as well. It's nice to see you here to give us some insight, and thank you, sir.
Well, thank you for having me. That's quite an honor.
And Senior Master of the Arts, Bob White, is always great to have you on. You give a real calm, a logical, rational response to all these questions. And the best part about it is that you have an open policy to say, let's explore it. Let's talk about it. So thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Anyway, on behalf of the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame, gentlemen, thank you so much. You have a great day. Salute.
All right.